Your heart will melt as a bear sees its father again after 39 years apart. Long shadows were cast across Thomas Bell's study by the rising sun, where decades passed. His wrinkled hands traced the lines of an old study paper and wildlife shot that has yellowed around the corners. Take a picture of him when he was younger, kneeling next to a bear cub that has a noticeable scar on its muzzle. Brought back a plethora of recollections that he had suppressed for 40 years. If you thought this tale was fascinating, please remember to like and subscribe to our channel. Tell us which city it is about. Stay tuned and you're watching Us. His retirement was quiet, broken by his phone's piercing ring. Sarah Matthews, the head ranger at Dr. Bell's heart raced as Yellowstone National Park spoke with such earnestness. I'm sorry to interrupt your retirement, but you should be aware that we've been monitoring and... The rangers described the rare grizzly bear in the park as having a strange... Its behavior and the scar across its muzzle are completely different from anything we've ever seen. Before Thomas sat down with his coffee cup, his hand trembled, matched flawlessly, raising the possibility that Boomer was the bear cub he had saved. The bear that had transformed his career was reared and returned to the wild 40 years ago. Wildlife Conservation Sarah added that the bear has been displaying odd trends, that it targets certain fields where researchers are employed, but never aggressively, almost as though it's observing us. A number of rangers have claimed to have heard a slight jingling sound before noticing it, which resembled a bell. When a bell was mentioned, Thomas's thoughts turned to Boomer's final day with him, when he had secured a tiny, before letting the little bear go. A brass bell is placed around his neck as a parting gift. During those initial vital weeks of freedom, the wild bell was meant to aid in tracking the cub. But after all, Bell Sarah's voice transported him back to the present, which we may utilize today. Your proficiency and familiarity with basic behavior, particularly with this specific... Thomas looked about his study at the potential value of the circumstance. The walls were lined with the life he had created after abandoning field study, with accolades and credentials attesting to an accomplished career in wildlife, but none of them could compare to that one picture of him with Boomer. I'll have to make more, he heard himself say, arrangements, which surprised him, even with how steady his voice was. But I can be. Within a week of the call ending, Thomas went to his bedroom closet. He directed the last frames of 2 pedestrians and extracted an ancient field pack with a faded bandana buried at the bottom. Was a tiny brass bell that was exactly the same as the one he had given Boomer and retained. As he packed his gear, he was reminded of the unique bond he had formed with the bear cub all these years. An email from Emma Hawthorne, a young biologist at the park, buzzed on his phone. Mala Yumara and his former research partner's daughter, who I heard got in touch with you, responded. I'll be your liaison during your stay, but even if this is the same bear, Thomas, I need you to comprehend something. Furthermore, if 40 years is a very long time, then anything you're looking for could not be here. Emma's compassion was appreciated by Thomas, but she didn't comprehend it was impossible to quantify or explain the bond he had with Boomer using scientific methods. There had been something more profound in study articles that defied common knowledge on the interactions between humans and animals that night. As Thomas E. was lured back to his old research diaries as he got ready for his journey, the pages included comprehensive notes on Boomer's growth, including his early steps, his humorous attempts to catch fish, and how he would react to the bell's sound. But more than that, they told a connections narrative that had influenced both of their lives. The hardest decision they had to make was to return Boomer to the wild. The baby bear had been prepared for Thomas's life, but Thomas wasn't certain he had been. He had dedicated himself to his studies in the weeks that followed, finally rising to the position of one of the foremost experts, behavior and conservation. But he had never before permitted himself to develop such a strong connection with any of his subjects. Thomas stared by his window as the sun sank, observing the hues fading from the earth. He would start his journey back to Yellowstone tomorrow, returning to the sky. The rational portion of his thinking returned to the wilderness that had once been his home and considered the prospect of getting back together with Boomer. Informed him that Emma was correct and that the likelihood that this was the same bear was, in Boomer's eyes, astronomical. Yet there was another aspect of him that still remembered the truck that ventured to. Regardless of how this bear turned out, I hope he packed the brass bell carefully in his luggage. Whether he was a Boomer or not, Thomas knew that the wilderness was about to transform his life once more. It was beckoning him back, and this time he was prepared to respond to the extensive. As Thomas passed past the entrance gate of Yellowstone National Park, the morning mist was still present. Every mile more into the park, the old pines were being clung to. The GPS on the rental car guided him back to his childhood, when these paths and clearings had served as his second home. Emma Hawthorne would be waiting at the research station, but Thomas hardly required the physical direction. As he entered the gravel parking lot, he recalled every twist and bend of these roads. A young woman wearing a ranger's uniform emerged from the research station onto the wooden porch where Emma Hawthorne had her office. She walked up to his car, seeing his resolute posture and perceptive eyes. With a steady gait that made Thomas think of her father, James. She welcomed Dr. Bell with a professional greeting during their research days together. But there was a tinge of worry in her eyes. "Welcome back to Yellowstone. I hope your trip wasn't too exhausted." Thomas reached into the passenger's seat and retrieved his old field bag. The brass bell was securely nestled among the mountains. "Haven't altered much," he said, inhaling the well-known aroma of pine and wild. Emma escorted Sage into the research station where maps are kept. "But I guess I have," and the walls were covered in tracking data. She indicated recent sightings of the bear in question, which were indicated by red pins across a topographical map that we have been tracking for the last 3 months. The pattern is peculiar and persistent. Although there are better feeding grounds to the north, Thomas looked at the map in this approximate area. His finger was carefully following the well-known path. "This was where we used to—" Emma's face softened as he paused to gather himself. This was Boomer's favorite spot to forage when he was younger. Somewhat, but her lack of faith in science was still apparent. "Dr. Bell, Thomas, You need to realize that even though this bear has simple SAR marks, Boomer the Unitary, there is very little probability that it will still be the same animal after 40 years. I am aware of the likelihood, Emma, that grizzlies in the wild rarely survive for more than 25 years, Thomas answered in a kind but strong tone. I've studied these animals all my career, but there is something about Boomer's distinctive features, included his nose scar, of course, but also his actions, patterns. He showed Emma the old photo he had taken out of his wallet. Notice the marking? It's not just any scar, is unique, resembling a crescent moon. Emma closely studied the ranger's photo. She acknowledged that descriptions do follow this pattern, but their conversation was... A quick tap on the door interrupted, and a young ranger rushed in, just out of breath. Breathe, Miss Hawthorne. We have new, big music coming toward Thunder Base, and we also discovered something else. The ranger displayed a plastic evidence bag with what seemed like berry seeds organized in an almost... Thomas's heart skipped a beat when he saw the intentional pattern on a flat rock. Where exactly did you locate these off the... This is the 3rd time, the ranger said, referring to the main trail near the ancient observation tower. This week we discovered something similar. Thomas looked at Emma, and his eyes lit up with recognition, just like Khmer used to do. I assumed that arranging his leftover berries in a pattern was just a peculiarity he had acquired while I was taking care of him, but even after his release, he kept doing it, and it became one of our indicators for Emma's increased interest in the evidence bag throughout those initial months of monitoring him. Is impressive. However, it might still be a coincidence that bears are sentient creatures that can acquire a variety of behaviors before allowing me to observe them for myself. Thomas insisted on taking pictures. I can tell if this is a boomer if I knew where these tracks are." Emma hesitated before nodding slowly, letting me know that only I would recognize him. "I knew that too early on. Out there now, but we must adhere to the correct procedures because this is still a wild and very dangerous planet. Regardless of whatever prior relationships you may have had, the animal we're dealing with was getting ready for the Thomasing, meticulously fastened the antique brass bell to his belt during the field expedition." The gentle jingling evoked a wave of recollections of Boomer's early tracking sessions when he was learning to fish, in the tenuous bonds of trust formed after innumerable times spent together that Belle Emma Thomas affirmed that I retained everything after observing him to see if it was the same as its twin. Perhaps it was sentimentality these years, or perhaps I knew I would need it again. As they loaded the equipment into Emma's research car, the sun finally emerged from the clouds, illuminating the enormous landscape outside. He finally realized that the wilderness in front of them was the solution to a question he had been thinking about for 40 years. What keeps it so beautiful this time of year? That was unclear if that would be the response he was hoping for, but for the first time in decades, he felt genuinely peaceful. The morning fog hung heavy in the valley, full of possibilities, as Thomas and their boots crunched quietly on the frost-covered ground, as Emma walked along the worn trail, creating a pattern. Every few yards they paused to look at indications, such as a scraped tree trunk, that matched Thomas's accelerating heartbeat, the rare tuft of fur caught on low-hanging branches or disturbed earth. Thomas muttered these marks as he ran his fingers down the deep claw scars in the bark of a pine. You can see how, when Boomer was younger, he created this design, which is organized in threes, and it became his hallmark. Squatting next to him, her doubts battling with professional interest, many bears mark trees in distance. She stopped to examine the marks in a similar manner as Thomas's territorial behavior. However, upon closer inspection, I must acknowledge that there is something quite systematic. Regarding them, they proceeded with their journey, ascending deeper into the foggy landscape. Thomas's belt's ancient brass bell produced a gentle intermelody that appeared unstoppably as they blended with the forest's natural sounds. Observing Boomer as he learnt to fish in the shallow streams in the last days before release and taught him how to find honey, Thomas was aware that their time together was running out when Emma appeared out of nowhere. Emma returned to the library in the daytime, muttered, extending her hand to block Thomas's gaze through the woods. About 50 yards ahead in the morning haze, a huge figure moved with Thomas's breath froze in his throat as he surprised Grace amid the pines. The way the bear shifted slightly to its right even at this distance had a familiar feel to it. He recalled the side where Boomer had injured his paw when he was a youngster. Emma warned, but Thomas was already trembling and grabbing for his binoculars, looking through the lenses. Bear's characteristics emerged, revealing it to be a massive male grizzly. As it turned its head, its thick, healthy fur was silvered with age. Thomas saw the characteristic crescent-shaped scar while looking at a fallen log. Just as he remembered, Thomas breathed his name on its snout. Emma's voice is full of emotion. The scar and his movements are actually him. Even as he looks into it, Boomer always has this distinct manner of, for a moment, the bear caught their scent in the morning breeze and abruptly raised its head, nostrils blazing. 40 years seemed to vanish in that one heart-stopping moment when its eyes met Thomas's through the mist. In those aged eyes, Thomas noticed a flicker of recognition, a glimmer of understanding that transcended time and the natural world, and then the bear appeared as fast as it had. Did you witness it melt back into the forest, leaving behind only disturbed underbrush and a profound silence? Thomas queried Emma in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper. The scar is exactly the same as the one in the picture, and based on his gaze towards me, Emma was already writing in her field journal and letting her scientific background take over the physical attributes that correspond with your... Yes, yeah, but Thomas, even though this is the case, we must maintain objectivity in this situation. Same bear, and I acknowledge that there is strong evidence that he is currently wild. You haven't understood for 40 years, Thomas said, continuing to gaze at the location where Boomer had a habit of making eye contact, and the bear had maintained that expression. Contact. He turned in a more direct and conscious manner than other bears. His eager and beseeching gaze towards Emma would have James consistently stated that there were aspects of animal behavior that science was unable to adequately explain. Emma's face softened when her father was mentioned. "Dad did talk about your work with Boomer," he added. Questioned all he believed to be true about ERS memory and cognition, she stopped, carefully selecting her next words. However, he also cautioned me about the risks associated with humanizing wild creatures. Thomas acknowledged her worry with a nod, saying, "I'm not romanticizing this, Emma. I spent. My field of study is behavior, and while I am aware of the dangers and reality, what Boomer and I both agreed that it was something special that should be studied, comprehended, and weren't rejected as they started returning to the Thomas, was in an area of soft earth at the research station when he spotted something that stopped him cold. Was just as he remembered, with a flawless print of the bear's right front paw. There was a tiny scar from a minor imperfection in the pad pattern. He contacted Emma about a long-ago injury, and she noticed that mark was in the pad. When he was learning to fish, he cut his paw on a sharp rock, yet it never completely recovered. He consistently left this unique mark on his prints, which Emma captured on camera and took measures. Her skepticism about science progressively giving way to curiosity about. She acknowledged that the evidence was beginning to mount, but if this is indeed the case, it simply complicates our predicament. Boomer's peculiar actions and seeming awareness of human presence could make. Thomas recognized that she was correct when she said that a bear that appeared was a worry for park administration. Regardless of its background, excessive familiarity around others could be considered dangerous. However, he was also aware that he couldn't leave now, not with him so close to re-establishing contact with the creature that had influenced his entire professional and personal perception of the relationship. The choice to spend the night camping at Boomer's with wild animals. Making territory wasn't simple, and Emma had first objected, stating park rules and safety procedures. But Thomas's contention on the. She was ultimately convinced of the value of observing nocturnal behavior, as the slackasai on the nocturnal behavior. As the sun started to drop, they pitched up camp in a tiny clearing that was close enough to the study station for security, yet far enough into the woods to keep their relationship with their subject intact. My father used to say, "I know Emma," as she assisted Thomas in erecting the specialized research apparatus around their campground. He claimed that you could sleep through anything except the sound of an alarm clock. "Tell me about your camping adventures," Thomas grinned as he adjusted the motion-sensitive cameras to capture the distressed animal. One of the cameras shot a large turtle and was taken by a computer. James was an exceptional observer who recognized that occasionally the best ideas came to him when you're not actively searching for significant scientific breakthroughs. They happen. He stopped working. That was Boomer's daily routine, naturally, as his thoughts went back. He revealed to us a novel and surprising aspect of behavior as darkness gathered over the woodland, the wilderness changed, and new noises surfaced, the gentle owls hooting, nocturnal creatures rustling, and the wind whispering. Thomas and Emma sat by the flames of their little campfire in the ancient pines. Emma replied softly, "Tell me about the day you had to release him." He was safely housed within a park-approved fire pit. Her scientific detachment briefly gave way to sincere curiosity, although her father never discussed it much. With the ancient brass bell in his lap, Thomas gazed into the flames. Boomer was physically prepared, strong and healthy on the most trying day of my career, completely able to endure in the wild, yet there was an agreement between. He continued to glance back at me as I escorted him to the release location, not in fear or doubt, but as if he was learning my face by heart, a branch suddenly pressing the dark trunk of some tree beyond their fire's light. Emma grabbed for her torch, but Thomas stopped her with a gentle touch on her arm and said, Listen to the sounds. Of motion drew nearer. The intentional pounding of falling leaves, the gentle whatever was out there wasn't attempting to conceal itself by scratching its claws on the bark. Presence. Thomas noticed the movement pattern, and his heart started to rush. Like boomers did when they circled their research camp decades ago, there were glimpses of the dark ness, a huge shape that moved between the trees in the light from the fire, of fur movements that appeared both recognizable and unreal. Emma clutched her tranquilizer gun tensely, but Thomas stayed motionless, his gaze focused on the visitor. The visitor made 2 circuits around their camp in the darkness outside. Thomas could hear its deep, rhythmic breathing as he drew it a little closer. And beneath it all, he heard a sound he recognized. A quiet huffing sound that, when Boomer had questions about something, Emma would whisper that we should immediately retreat to the vehicle, but Thomas was immobilized and sent back in time to innumerable nights, such as this one, where a young Boomer would explore their camp and discover the differences between their world and his. The bear in the darkness moved with the same liberated care and curiosity. Grace abruptly stopped moving, and for a few extended moments the forest held its breath. And then the presence disappeared, as silently as it had appeared, leaving only the sound of retreating. Emma's footsteps in the brush caused Thomas to release a breath he didn't know he was holding. He used to explore our camp, Emma, by moving the noises he produced, was already taking journal entries, her hands trembling a little but her scientific background holding firm. She acknowledged that the behavior is strikingly consistent with your historical observations, but it's also extremely. It is uncommon for a wild bear to act so at ease in the presence of a human camp. As the night deepened, Thomas showed no signs of aggression or food-seeking behavior. Found himself unable to sleep, he sat by the dwindling embers of their fire, lost in memories and possibilities. The antique brass bell sat heavy in his hands, its surface reflecting the last glimmers of firelight. Just before dawn, as the first glimpses of gray touched the eastern sky, Thomas heard movement again. This time it was closer, much closer. He remained completely motionless as heavy footsteps reached the edge of their camp. There was a gentle clink of metal against wood, and then the footsteps fled when the sun eventually rose. Thomas found his brass bell was stolen from where he'd left it by the fire. In its place, hanging from a neighboring branch at exactly his eye level, was another bell, old, corroded, but obviously the twin of the one he'd given Boomer 40 years ago. The finding. Red bell. Discovery. The old bell sent vibrations through the research team. Emma spent the morning photographing it, measuring it, and examining its wear patterns to historical data. Thomas nonetheless couldn't take his eyes off it. Every dent, every scratch, recounted the narrative of 40 years in the woods. The odds of this being coincidence are astronomical, Emma admitted, carefully setting the bell in a protective case. The location, the time, it shows not only acknowledgement, but complicated memory and deliberate communication. Black clouds began gathering over the mountains as they prepared their next move. The weather state had warned of an incoming storm system, but Thomas insisted on traveling farther into the zone where the bear. The most often mentioned location is an ancient ranger station located around 2 meters north. Emma mentioned that we may use her topographical chart if the weather permits for, she looked at Thomas, the shelter, which hasn't been kept up in years, yet it's still under more menacing SC scrutiny, structurally sound. They embarked on a journey that had almost. Thomas saw evidence of recent bear activity everywhere, freshly shattered, and vanished beneath decades of natural growth. Some limbs, disturbed ground, and stones that seemed to have been placed purposely next to some trees, these markers. When we were tracking together, Thomas clarified, by referring to a specific arrangement that Boomer utilized to do this, would arrange stones in designs, establishing points of reference for our study search routes. Emma took pictures of the stones, the growing body of information challenging skepticism regarding the degree of cognitive function necessary for this kind of behavior that surpasses what has been observed in wild bears. The first drops. As they arrived to a clearing, thunder roared across the valley and the wind increased. Emma pointed to a tree that was wildly tearing through the trees with more and more force. They arrived at the abandoned ranger station, a structure only discernible through the gathering gloom. Precisely as when the storm hit Ernest, the ancient wooden building squealed against the wind, but its walls held. While Thomas relocated to a dusty cabinet, firm Emma discovered some emergency supplies there. He couldn't explain why lightning lighted the window that was drawn by some instinct. In one of these ACs, the clearing in stark flashes, turning the surroundings into a sequence of frozen moments. Thomas noticed Boomer's enormous figure standing still in the rain. The bear, silhouetted against the dark forest, was staring straight at the station. Emma hissed, "I don't dare move the northeast window." Right at Thomas. Emma went cautiously forward, gasping when a second flash showed the bear standing there, unfazed by the storm's fur, was matted by the rain, highlighting the silver that age possessed. Emma bounded toward him, brought to his coat, revealing the characteristic scar on his muzzle. Just as Thomas recalled, he is purposefully arranging himself to face Emma. He kept eye contact as he heard her speech, which was hardly audible above the storm. While maintaining a safe distance, Thomas experienced an unexpected behavior, strong want to go outside and bridge the gap between them. Yet something urged him to wait in Boomer's stance, while the bear's posture expressed a complicated message recognition combined with a cautious relationship that is balanced by the knowledge of contractuals. For what felt like hours, they kept this quiet for years in the wild. Decay Boomer stayed put, adjusting his weight from time to time. But decades of silent communication, Thomas stood equally motionless, never taking his eyes off the station window. He's not merely seeing the storm's elemental drama as it passes between them. Thomas stated quietly that he was protecting us in this manner, which is how he used to stand. Emma was constantly at the edge of our perimeter, facing possible threats while we camped in uncharted country. Been taking constant notes as she grapples with the remarkable spectacle in front of her, drawing on her scientific knowledge. The behavioral ramifications are astounding, indicating that memory retention is not the only thing involved. However, over decades, learnt protective behaviors have persisted. As the storm subsided, Boomer at last walked slowly and purposefully, raising his head from time to time. With his head fully exposed in the low light, Thomas could see that even with his head as it aged, the bear was in excellent health, strong and completely adjusted to his untamed life. Then, in a gesture that made others cry, Boomer raised his right paw just a little bit above the ground, in the same way that Thomas's eyes. When he was a cub, he hurt poor with the same distinctive motion he used to approach Camp Emma, exhaled in recognition of her actions. According to his father's old study notes, he uses the identical signaling system that you created. Before Thomas could react, a far-off sound during his rehabilitation captured Boomer's attention. The bear's entire body shifted in a quick direction towards the trees. Shifting from tender acknowledgement to vigilant attention with a last glance at the station, he vanished into the brush, traveling rather fast for his size while the storm persisted. Withdraw, but Thomas stayed at the window, taking in what he had just seen. What his heart had sensed from the start was validated by the experience. Was in fact a Boomer, and their relationship had managed to survive for 4 decades of nature study. There was a crystalline clarity in the air the morning following the storm due to separation. Thomas stood in a way that brought out the stark relief of every feature in the landscape. The 2 bells that are presently dangling from his belt at the ranger station's porch are soft. He had created his own chime, which blended with the sound of water falling from the trees. Deciding that it was time to go to the clearing where he and Boomer had spent so many hours during the long night. I'm not sure if this was a smart move during those early years, 40 years ago. Emma mentioned examining her radio equipment and tranquilizer rifle following last night's encounter. Rather of aiming for more, we should concentrate on recording the behavioral patterns we've seen. Direct communication. Thomas recognized her worry, but he was also aware that this, He clarified that the clearance was unique because it needed something beyond the usual scientific procedure. As they got ready for the trek, Boomer discovered how to trust others and form the habits that made him. The trip to the clearing was unusual since it's the only location where we can completely comprehend what's happening here. Thomas was quite aback by how quickly the trail returned to him after leading them through some of the park's oldest growth forest. Every landmark and unique tree appeared to have been patiently awaiting his return in his memory. "This is where we used to work together," he remarked, pausing at the edge of a natural gap in the forest. Over the years, clearance had transformed what was once an open area into grassland. Although the area was partly covered in deep vegetation and young trees, its fundamental characteristics remained the same. The natural amphitheater was formed by the morning light filtering through the canopy. Dad's, the little creek that sliced through one corner of the surrounding slopes. "This location was referenced in old journals," Emma murmured quietly as she took in the scene. "Thomas moved to the center, so they named it the classroom, because of how much you both learnt about bear behavior. This is where Boomer's memories of the clearing wash over him with every stride. When he first learnt to answer the bell, we would play a game in which I would conceal and he would have to guess. I believe I tactfully agreed that he could not guess. His faith in signals was strengthened when he discovered me utilizing the sound as a guide. Drawing both bells from his belt, Thomas held them aloft so they wouldn't be reliant on human presence. Capture the morning light, the contrast between them was remarkable. One was well maintained and polished, while the other had been worn down by 40 years. Despite spending years in the wilderness, their voices harmonized when they rang together. Emma questioned, "Exactly what are you planning?" even though she was fully aware of the Thomas acknowledged, answering a question that violates every guideline in your manual. He inhaled deeply before starting to ring all the bells at once, allowing their combined sound to reverberate over the valley. The familiar melody is a straightforward 3-ring pattern that is followed by a pause that is music never stops, pause. As it had so many years before, the woodland became silent, as if the clearing. Thomas proceeded with the pattern, each set of rings containing decades of memories, while every creature held its breath. Emma, with her scientific detachment, stood at the edge of the clearing, fighting with the indisputable force of the voice. After a few minutes, the thick woodland on the northern border of the crescent-shaped mark on his snout that had initially proclaimed him to be a warrior expanded into shadow, and Boomer proceeded with purposeful grace, taking measured steps, and cautious in the bright morning light, allowing the silver streak to be seen in every detail. The battle scars of a liff were untamed, and most notably the bear hesitated at the border of the crescent-shaped mark on his snout that had initially reminded Thomas of Yellowstone. Of the clearing, his gaze focused on Thomas and his posture alert but not hostile. Thomas kept ringing the bell, displaying the same profound intelligence that had made him unique all those years ago. Boomer took another stride as the sound of the bells faded to a whisper. He moved forward and then again without showing any signs of fear or aggressiveness, simply a methodical, deliberate approach that mentioned memory and recognition. He was now close enough for Thomas to see. A violent crashing sound from the undergrowth broke the calm as he was breathing in the cool morning air. A younger male bear, perhaps little older than 5, rushed into the clearing. When he saw Thomas and Emma as intruders in his territory, his posture became hostile and his hackles were raised. Then disproved Emma's presumptions regarding bear behavior and Boomer movement. He moved rather quickly for his age and took up position between the people and the smaller bear. The younger bear is not challenged by Brooking's evident protective authority. Grown up, perhaps perplexed by the behavior of the older bear, Boomer replied with a roar that appeared to tremble the earth itself, a sound that carried decades of acquired authority in addition to volume. After a brief period of resistance, the younger bear gradually withdrew and vanished into the forest. Boomer went back to Thomas as he had appeared, but there was a new depth of intensity in his eyes that It was a glance that appeared to encompass their common history of the protracted years of separation, going beyond mere recognition. And this unanticipated moment when their paths had once more intersected, the occurrence in New York City by midday, Thomas and Emma saw the clearance spread like wildfire across the park administration, encountered Sarah Matthews, the chief ranger, in an urgent meeting, and the park headquarters conference room was tense with a group of park executives. To clarify what we're dealing with here, conflicting viewpoints and worries are what Sarah started sharing. Pictures of a grizzly bear displaying hitherto unheard-of degrees of contact with people who are actively approaching research facilities, and now seeming to step in possible issues with wildlife. But the scientific implications are intriguing. Thomas leaned closer and spoke. Visitor safety must be our top priority. Stable in spite of his own conflict. What do you mean by an exceptional exchange? I am citing proof of something extraordinary. Boomer is not approaching at random. Rather, he is exhibiting sophisticated social actions that contradict our understanding of the long-term cognitive function of ERS signs, Dr. B interrupted. Given your past interactions with this animal, Richard Morrison, the park safety coordinator, concerning a grizzly bear in a national park that is visited by millions of people every year, the fact that it displays remarkable comfort among people raises the possibility of its harm, not decreases it, highlighted her scientific background, lending credence to her statements, and our observations imply something more complex. The bear's actions demonstrate advanced risk assessment and decision-making. His intervention with the smaller bear this morning shows not aggression, but rather a practice. Sarah changed her protective instinct, which actually lowers the risk to people. Despite her discomfort in her chair, we are thinking about moving the bear to the Cedar Grove Conservation Area. These behaviors can be examined in a controlled setting at the center. The suggestion struck Thomas like a physical blow without endangering public safety, and Cedar Grove was a reputable institution, but regardless of how big the cage was, it was still a constrained setting. Or well-designed. You can't do that to him, he objected, his business-like manner briefly faltering. And Boomer has a wife and 40 years of living freely. He has not only survived, but thrived, and developed into an essential component of this ecosystem, which also include human visitors. Morrison tallied what occurs when families with children come across a bear during the busiest travel season. That doesn't exhibit typical avoidance behaviors. We modify our procedures. Thomas maintained that we create new rules in light of what we discover. This is a chance to learn something remarkable about the interaction between people and wildlife. In addition to being inhumane, taking him into captivity would result in a significant loss. Emma took out her research notes and searched our material, which reveals that the bear keeps a steady territory away from popular tourist destinations. His contacts have only been with research staff who are prepared to deal with wildlife encounters. There is no signs of aggressive behavior against people or food. Seeking behavior, the discussion went on for hours with suggestions and counter-proposals flew across the table. Thomas felt the burden of 40 years, putting pressure on him despite all the study and findings that had led to this. What about reaching a compromise at the point where he had to defend Boomer's freedom? At last, Sarah proposed massaging her temples and establishing further surveillance, a wider restricted area surrounding his recognized domain, and create new procedures especially for this circumstance. But she extended her hand to prevent Thomas's prompt consent at Pascal's touch, just as he had when she grabbed his hand. The first indication of any actions that would put guests in danger. We go back to the Emma added we could also use this as an educational opportunity, as a relocation option. Establish a research program focused on examining these distinct behaviors as soon as possible, something that could improve our knowledge of how wildlife thinks, while keeping a safe distance. For Thomas was hopeful that I could contribute to the protocol design. After making this remark, he said that since I am the only one who truly knows Boomer behavior, we might develop rules that safeguard both the Morrison was doubtful about the public and his freedom, and what occurs when word spreads and people begin actively searching for this amiable bear. We might have a circus, their hands. After which we take charge of the story Emma proposed and portray it as a serious scientific research, not a hobby, highlights the significance of preserving space and honoring wildlife, and using it to educate people about. The meeting went into the evening, and Thomas's mind began to wander to the topic of appropriate wildlife engagement. Boomer's placement of IED between them and the threat during that morning's encounter in the clearing. Intelligence in his eyes, the unmistakable proof that their relationship had not been destroyed by 4 decades of wildlife, all suggested something that went beyond common issues with wildlife management. So Sarah ultimately called for, Adduct B will want your input before we make the choice to immediately implement restricted zones and increased monitoring. Regarding the procedures, Ms. Hawthorne, kindly draft a thorough research proposal with an emphasis on secure observation approaches. But be aware of this: if there's any sign that public safety is at risk, we'll need to act more forcefully. Because they departed the meeting, Emma saw Thomas's distracted look. You're considering Cedar Grove, aren't you? You nodded slowly. Thomas? Boomer's early years were spent in everything unique about him in captivity, including his intelligence and capacity to connect the worlds of the wild and the human. Resulted from striking the ideal balance between natural freedom and human connection. Placing him at a facility at this time would be equivalent to wiping everything out. He's still the early morning mist. As Thomas got ready for what he felt would be a pivotal day, he held on to the valley. Following the stressful discussion with park officials, he realized that he needed to show more than just management between Boomer and himself. He had to demonstrate their relationship might actually improve knowledge and safety at the park where you intend to reenact the previous training? Emma questioned as she assisted him in setting up the observation equipment. Are you not exercising? Her tone was equal to Thomas uses professional interest and concern metrics rather than training exercises. She stopped for a moment too, then said, Nephew, exercise. However, it checked the bells at his belt gaze, which were always games to be rectified gently. Boomer, that's what made them unique. He didn't engage because he had to, but rather because he wanted to. Selected a number of sites across Boomer's domain. Each one chosen for Emma had maintained that, because of its resemblance to the locations where Thomas and Boomer had collaborated 40 years prior, installing remote cameras and surveillance tools at every location to make sure everything would be recorded for the park's safety and scientific objectives. Emma reminded him that authorities are actively monitoring this, so if something goes wrong. Thomas nodded in understanding. The gravity of what they were trying to do, which goes beyond simply demonstrating our relationship, to demonstrate that now was the time to speak. The happiest of times in our relationship. Yes, we talked about this alone, and we brainstormed, and definitely gave the accepted clarity possible. Emma reminded him, what else? Safer interactions between people and wildlife can result from mutual understanding. The first spot for everyone was a tiny grove where fallen logs produced furniture patterns. Everett was clearly impressed with the location, and Boomer's favorite locations for what Thomas had dubbed their seeking game was a natural hiding area. Advanced variation solving that had aided in the bear's problem-solving abilities. Thomas instructed him to employ several senses as he positioned himself, in a sound from the visual clues of the bell's scent tracking, but more significantly, it taught him Emma positioned herself at the observation point, equipment ready, and shown patience and control when approaching people. Thomas grinned. You really think he'll remember the rules after all this time? Quietly observe as he started the 3-ring sequence they had been using for so long. Of the bell, then moving through the grove in a particular way before locating a good hiding place. He waited with the bell motionless behind a huge fallen pine. Minutes went by in the forest's waiting calm, interrupted only by the gentle hum of the ordainedly quiet streets. As people occasionally wandered in the murmur of running water, the sounds of forest birds and rustling foliage, eyes on her surveillance apparatus which tracks any movement in the neighborhood, then very imperceptibly, the forest sound pattern started to shift and a big object was passing through the undergrowth, its development methodical but remarkably silent given its magnitude. Thomas stayed motionless, recalling how this aspect of the game had consistently tried Boomer's patience just as much as his tracking abilities. The motion halted through a hole in the logs, allowing Thomas to observe Boomer standing at the grove's edge, his head raised to test the air. The bear's stance was calm yet focused, just like it had been during their previous training session. Boomer started working the area gradually and carefully, moving in a widening spiral, following the precise search method that Thomas had instructed him to use when he arrived at locations where Thomas's desperation had begun. Before continuing, he would pause to examine whether the aroma was stronger. An intelligent creature's deliberate search pattern was demonstrated by the bear's instinctive behavior. Using techniques she has learned, Emma watched in awe as Boomer methodically removed hiding places as he approached Thomas's location. "This is amazing." Speaking into her recorder, the bear is exhibiting sophisticated problem-solving skills in addition to memorized behaviors, abilities, and methodical search habits. Boomer eventually came to a stop just in front of rather than going straight to Thomas's hiding spot. He sat back on his instincts and produced the identical indication he used to give a gentle puffing sound. Following a successful search, Thomas gently came out of concealment and spoke quietly in the same way. He maintained the tone he had employed 40 years prior. "Well done, old friend." Seated and observing Thomas with the same keen intuition they had seen in the clearing, then making a motion that drew Emma to tears as the bear softly rested, setting his enormous head on his shoulders, a position of trust that revealed their long relationship to be a brotherhood. After drawing close together, letting as Thomas called quietly, observing his body language, to total relaxation, he recalls not only the game but all the work. After establishing safety procedures, they spent the following hour recording Boomer's actions, while Thomas guided him through additional reminiscent games, distance-maintaining exercises, responsive movement, and mutual trust. Every time the bears showed not only awareness of the activity, but also an advanced comprehension of their fundamental ideas, which goes beyond straightforward. Emma observed that after watching the video, he was demonstrating signs of true cognitive improvement and knowing how to modify behaviors that have been learnt for decades to fit the needs of the present. Could transform. Thomas saw a developing comprehension of ERS sign intelligence and memory as the morning drew to a close. Feeling of hope, since they had captured an unusual demonstration by a wild bear, not only recalled deeds but also knowledge of intricate social dynamics and security procedures. This would undoubtedly assist in persuading park officials that Boomer was not a danger, but rather an exceptional chance to learn and comprehend the achievements of the Emmas. Radio crackled when the first indications of danger emerged, just as the morning's protests had just begun to be recorded. Using park rangers' urgent signals, a group of tourists somehow discovered the amiable bear and were able to evade the restricted area signs, which is just what Morrison was concerned about, Emma remarked as she hurried to pack. People are now attempting to have their own close encounters after someone must have discussed what they witnessed with her equipment. As they rushed to the station place, Thomas felt his heart drop. Boomer's extraordinary bond with people could be the same thing that made him exceptional, put him in danger because they could hear shouts and lively discussion coming from a distance. Sound broke the natural silence of the forest, and when they got closer, they saw a gathering of perhaps 8 tourists using phones. Held high as they advanced more into Boomer's domain, in spite of the prominently displayed warning indicators and obstacles they had overcome. Lured by the promise of what they thought would be a simple exercise with a bear of showing this operation, and the promise of getting a small poster-sized package for their use, You must leave this region right away if you want to take a picture with a tame bear." Emma clearly stated in her voice that this is a restricted area for. A man with an expensive camera turned to wildlife protection and ongoing research. "We heard about the bear that remembers individuals, and we only wanted to take some photos. We're irritated by the interruption. What's important is that you're endangering a valuable research subject in addition to yourself," Thomas said, attempting to sound calm in spite of his mounting nervousness. "This isn't a zoo. This zoo display features a wild animal in its native environment," and one of the women in the group laughed. "But we've heard that he's amiable and enjoys playing games with researchers." Before Thomas or Emma can give a profound response, "A few pictures won't harm." The tourists turned excitedly as the puffing sound from the woods on their right caused the cameras to rise. But Thomas could tell right away that something wasn't right because the sound held a tone instead of Boomer's typical kind greeting of anxiety and caution, as they could see Boomer's enormous figure through the woods. His tense body language and obvious evidence of stress were evident in his motions. Numerous strangers' careless invasion of his domain, their loud shouts, and his inherent defense instincts had been activated by abrupt movements. But no one moved. Through the ecstatic commotion, Thomas ordered, "Lower your cameras gently and avoid eye contact," but in their enthusiasm, the tourists performed the exact opposite, with phones and cameras flashing, voices in rows. In a terrifyingly risky attempt to entice Boomer, someone even flung a granola bar in his direction out of enthusiasm. Boomer's response to his getting closer was instantaneous. He sprung to his full height and gave a warning roar that at last made the situation's truth evident to the obtrusive guests' cries. As the group started to worry, some people started to run, replacing the enthusiastic banter. Thomas's voice boomed. "Exactly the wrong answer to a bear encounter," strolling carefully after me around the clearing without rushing. To everyone's astonishment, Boomer's hostile behavior stopped when Thomas's voice was heard. The bear stayed vigilant and obviously unhappy, but he maintained his position, exhibiting the composed reaction that Thomas had so diligently cultivated in Emma, effectively organized the tourists' retreat decades ago, while Thomas remained in his place and spoke to Boomer in a steady, calm tone he had employed during their morning activities. And although the bear's eyes stayed fixated, his agitation eventually subsided. After the tourists were securely led out of the restricted area, Thomas turned to Emma on the receding group. "We are quite concerned because this is precisely what we were worried people wouldn't comprehend. Boomer's distinct behavior doesn't invite conversation. On the contrary, it strengthens the barriers we set." Emma was already on her radio, reporting the situation to Park, which was even more significant. "The answer from headquarters was just astounding," she observed. "Between the two men, despite obvious provocation, he demonstrated restrained, defensive behavior. In addition to acting aggressively, he even obeyed voice commands during a crisis, although Thomas was aware of this." End quote. The worst concerns of the park administration about public safety were that the occurrence would have consequences. Practically came to pass, despite Boomer's remarkable control. "The very fact that such an encounter had taken place would cause us to be extremely concerned. Need to go past this," he remarked as Boomer slowly calmed down and retreat back into the deeper forest. "Event demonstrates the dangers and possibilities. Boomer demonstrated that even under stress, he recalls and follows the procedures we set up, which isn't a—" Emma nodded. "But her responsibility is a fantastic benefit for park safety. Try telling Morrison and the safety board that your expression remained concerned. They will see this as evidence that the current state of affairs is unsustainable, therefore we must make our point as quickly as possible." Started recording the event because Thomas couldn't get Boomer's response out of his mind. The way he had toned his tendencies for natural defense that are not entirely comfortable enough to support additional human techniques, or the unbridled violence that would have validated the park's greatest anxieties even in death. Yet he was still managing the delicate balance between being sensible and being wild. The atmosphere in the park the afternoon after the tourist incident was a combination of learnt behavior and natural instinct. Tension was high in the administrative building when Thomas appeared before an emergency committee in the morning. While security camera footage of the tourist interaction was displayed on one screen, research footage was displayed on another. The difference between the two situations could not have been more obvious. Morrison's declaration of pieing in the tourist encounter video was exactly the circumstance we were worried about. In a particularly tense moment, visitors are purposefully breaking into forbidden areas in order to find this bear. Someone will eventually be harmed, so Sarah Matthews watched both sets of tape with a frown. But I must note that she interrupted to say that the bear's answer was, "Dr. B, you have amazing control. Could you describe what we're witnessing in terms of patterns of behavior?" Thomas leaned forward, grasping the chance. "What?" This is the outcome of early cognitive development that has continued over decades of life in the wild. In the morning video, Boomer shows the visitor how to solve complicated problems and engage with others. Confrontation. He demonstrates the capacity to control his innate defensive reactions. According to learnt behaviors, Emma had been examining the video frame by frame. According to Frame's scientific viewpoint, the bear's response to the visitors was provocative. In fact, he provided a classic illustration of proper defensive behavior. Clear warning signs, kept a safe distance, and defused the situation when the problem rises. The circumstance was handled well. This isn't merely a learnt behavior, it's complex danger evaluation and reaction, which is all extremely interesting. Morrison counted from a research standpoint. But that doesn't alter the reality that we have a potentially hazardous situation. Information about this bear is already making the rounds on social media. Continuing the narrative, we cannot afford to have more visitors attempt to enter the restricted sections. As Thomas felt his way through, when frustration increased, we tightened the regulations and increased the number of ranger patrols, increased the severity of the penalties for infractions, but do not penalize Boomer for his human misconduct. Dr. Patricia Chen, the park's lead, gave precisely the kind of thoughtful, methodical reaction we would expect from any wild animal. What worries me, according to the wildlife biologist who had been silently watching until now, isn't only the immediate safety concern. We're facing an unprecedented situation here, as this bear is exhibiting social, behavioral adaptability and cognition that could fundamentally alter our comprehension of reality. Given his wild animal intelligence, it could seem safer to relocate him to a controlled setting, yet we wouldn't be able to observe these behaviors in their natural environment. Hours of discussion ensued, with suggestions ranging from moving Boomer to Cedar Grove right away to creating a completely new study technique centered on his distinct behaviors. Thomas believed that he was protecting the prospect of a deeper freedom rather than merely Boomer's. Understanding between people and wildlife. Take another look at this morning's footage. Thomas insisted on going back to the seeking game sequence. This is an animal behavior, not merely a conditioned response or a technique that has been learnt, exhibiting knowledge of intricate social norms and boundaries in the same comprehension that enabled him to react suitably to the tourist incident, in which Emma displayed her most recent analysis of her tablet, shows that his behavioral tendencies are consistent. That implies these aren't isolated events or coincidental occurrences. His answers are methodical, measured, and situation appropriate. Even throughout the tourist interaction, he demonstrated what we might. His cautions increased in proportion to the perceived severity of the call. Sarah Matthews scratched her temples in apparent struggle with the intricacy of the situation. The scientific potential is apparent, but we also need to take certain risks. Thomas took advantage of this opportunity to find a solution that addresses both. And then let's create a thorough management plan, one that safeguards boomers and the general public while enabling us to research this unique situation we can create. Clearly defined borders, more stringent enforcement, and instructional initiatives to educate people about the importance of keeping a safe distance. Dr. Chen nodding thoughtfully. We could use this as a template for research on the coexistence of humans and wildlife, rather than seeing Boomer's distinctive behaviors could be used to have a deeper understanding of how to handle interactions between people and wildlife across the park system. Morrison was doubtful, but his resistance appeared to be eroding any time. Such a scheme would require stringent safety procedures and assurances that the study wouldn't promote additional illegal contact attempts. But what if we included it in the parks? Emma recommended using the current wildlife education programs to instruct guests about observing wildlife limits instead than attempting to cross them, showing them that having an understanding of animals does not entail attempting to keep them as pets. Thomas felt a ray of hope as the meeting went on because of the tourist incident. Despite being worrisome, Boomer's special ability had shown something vital. He made him potentially more useful for comprehending how people and wildlife interact, rather than making him more deadly. He could comfortably coexist outside the window as long shadows were formed by the afternoon sun. Somewhere out there, Boomer was traversing the expansive park, going about his living on the edge of wisdom and wildness, between instinct and knowledge, and comprehending his own existence, questioned their presumptions regarding wildlife behavior, and provided a glimpse of possibilities beyond straightforwardness. With a strange clarity, the daybreak over Yellowstone marked the transition from conservation to actual coexistence. Tomas stood at the edge of a kind that seemed to accentuate every detail of the landscape. The two bells were silent at his belt as he watched the wilderness awaken over the past few days from the porch of the research station. Boomer was both worn out and resolute after intense debates regarding his future. In the morning, Emma came out of the station with 2 steaming coffee mugs, giving Thomas one of the mugs he's staying with after the tracking team reported new signs close to the eastern ridge. Precisely as we hoped he would comprehend, inside the assigned research zone, Thomas responded with a tinge of pride in his ability to respect boundaries better than most people. Chevis's voice always has, and even as a cub, he was able to distinguish between different playgrounds. In confined areas, the park officials had given them a week to prove the legitimacy of their every action, and every interaction in the suggested management plan had to be carefully studied and recorded. The pressure was tremendous. But Thomas perceived it as an opportunity, as a chance to validate his long-held belief in Boomer's exceptional Emma mentioned taking out capabilities. I've been looking over Dad's old research notes. He wrote something intriguing regarding your training techniques on her iPad, claiming that you haven't actually coached Boomers. There is a distinction between what you said and what Thomas remembered. Bringing back your father's understanding of what made Boomers unique in the conventional sense. Wildlife training relies on conditioning responses, and Boomer and I created a conversation in which he discovered more than just what to do, but why it was important. They each spent the morning establishing new observation posts across the research zone. Position was carefully chosen to facilitate monitoring while keeping safe distances. Thomas insisted on combining aspects that would be recognizable to Boomer, particular arrangements of stones, designated trees that mimic their old border indications. It's intriguing, Emma noticed, as they functioned. You're not. By installing observation posts, you're building a communication system that he'll understand. Everything in the outdoors is about communicating, Thomas stated, placing a distinctive arrangement of pebbles that had originally indicated safe rest spots. Animals read the terrain continually. What we're doing is adding a layer of meaning that bridges our world and theirs. When they finished putting up the last observation site, a familiar puffing sound drew their attention. Boomer had emerged from the tree line, his enormous figure moving with his peculiar grace that bellied his bulk. He approached one of the stone aras arrangements, inspecting it with evident curiosity. Watch, Thomas murmured to Emma, who was already recording. View how he's interpreting the markings. Boomer moved from one arranged position to another, his actions showing evident recognition of the pattern at each point. He would pause, scent the air, and make modest modifications to his stance, exactly as he had been instructed to do decades ago, When creating safe understandings, it's amazing how Emma expressed her scientific skepticism about observation distances, giving rise to the question of whether he's actively interacting with the system rather than merely identifying the indicators. And perhaps the most important answer in science literature recently is that evidence that something is correct does not prove it can be repeated. Exhibiting beyond basic spatial memory and pattern recognition, Thomas observed behavioral conditioning as Boomer finished his circuit of the observation posts, and the actions of the bears were purposeful, almost ritualistic, as though he were restating his comprehension of what you're witnessing is the outcome of this common language of respect and boundaries, of trust based on comprehension. Thomas clarified how Boomer picked up these habits. So, the information has persisted because it made sense to him, not because he was compelled to follow it. The bear remained in perfect posture at the edge of a clearing for 40 years. His posture was alert yet relaxed in relation to the closest marker, displaying none of the agitation that put Emma had made a note of the tourist encounter by observing his body language, recording flawless adherence to safety distances while maintaining total comfort inside the designated parameters. But this isn't simply recall behavior, which is a sophisticated and proactive interaction with established procedures. Thomas was filled with optimism that this was precisely what they needed to show the park administration that Boomer's special skills made he as a benefit to park safety rather than a threat, because of his comprehension of the ability to communicate through established patterns and boundaries could be used as a model for managing animals. As the morning conflict raged, they meticulously documented Boomer's interactions between each movement and different components of their observation system. Every remark strengthened the mounting evidence that this was not your typical, in the case of human-wildlife contact, this was a more complex and profound situation. Access to lived life contact. This was a more complex and profound situation, a sincere conversation between animals that had managed to survive 4 decades of, "You know what, this makes me think of Emma," she murmured quietly, going over the footage of those investigations into native tracking systems where animal behavior knowledge is transmitted through generations. But this is distinct because it is a direct transfer of knowledge. Thomas observed as Boomer stood between species that had been protected for decades. Thomas started his cautious retreat into the forest, making sure that every move he made matched their predetermined marks exactly. He stated unequivocally what we are witnessing, which is why we cannot lose him to plant a grove. This is about the potential for real life, not simply about one bear or one person. Coexistence, about figuring out how to respect both humans and the wilderness while sharing it. As the observing week came to an end, safety and animal freedom, Thomas sat in the tiny library of the research station where anxiety hung in the air like an impending storm. Emma arrived carrying a stack of animal studies spanning decades, including his own early articles on boomers, new data printouts, and she displays a mix of worry and exhilaration. She stretched the papers across the desk and remarked, "The most recent research is amazing. We're noticing consistent patterns of complex behavior that contradicts our understanding of long-term wildlife cognition. But Thomas completed her idea, and the park board is still worried about liability worries at tomorrow's meeting. The information in front of them revealed an amazing tale about the previous week. They had baby boomers actively adjusting to the present norms rather than only recalling them. Situations he had showed that he understood intricate territorial boundaries and responded appropriately to differing human presences, and even contribute to the preservation of natural order by discouraging other bears from nearby study locations. See this sequence that Emma indicated. He has genuinely changed the traditional boundary marking techniques to accommodate new tourists in a number of photos. Thomas, he's not just remembering, he's solving problems in real time." Lady War examined the pictures. His heart swelled with pride and worry as he displayed them. Precisely what they must observe. But will they comprehend what they are seeing? Their conversation was cut short by a knock on the door, and Sarah Matthews entered with a solemn expression. We have another setting up a team of wildlife photographers is organizing some sort of protest tomorrow, arguing that the opportunity to keep this smart bear in the wild is too great. They intend to enter the restricted area en masse in order to record his actions that made Thomas's blood run cold. They'll be putting Boomer and themselves in danger, at jeopardy. Do they not see that his distinct behavior relies on preserving appropriate boundaries? Which is the irony, Emma remarked sourly. Their very efforts, to Sarah nodded grimly. Documenting his intelligence could force the park to remove and move him for safety reasons. Morrison is citing this as proof that things are getting out of control. He's saying that Thomas spoke up because Bear's reputation alone is posing a risk to public safety. He quickly gathered his field equipment, and we must present our case tonight. What are your plans for the last demonstration of what we're actually dealing with here? Emma inquired, sensing the resolve in his voice. Something that would demonstrate Thomas responded by inspecting the bells at his place and telling them the genuine worth of what we have here. Belled Boomer is evidence of more than just a scientific edity or curiosity. The midday sun was already casting a different light on the relationship between people and wildlife. Long shadows as they prepared their gear, in an area that Thomas had picked out with care-integrated components from all of the prior fruitful exchanges in a natural and helpful way, provided well-defined sight lines and indicators that Boomers would acknowledge that will record everything, as Emma promised. Arranging several camera angles for each movement and reaction, we must demonstrate to them that this is about more than simply one exceptional bear, but the potential for a fresh strategy in wildlife management. Sarah observed the professional involvement in the preparations. You genuinely think this can work? That we can figure out how to maintain this special circumstance while also maintaining public safety? Think we should give it a shot, Thomas answered, looking about before them. Boomer is a living evidence that transcends scientific curiosity. That knowledge, memory, and comprehension can help us close the gap between the wild and our world. If we lose that, due to miscommunication and fear, the sun was lowering as they finished their meal. Meanwhile, they could hear the forest's far-off sounds as it settled into the evening somewhere in the gathering dusk. Luna made her way back to the tower, treading warily as she returned. Rhythms. The twin bells were silent as Thomas stood in his designated spot, Belt awaiting the appropriate time to start their last presentation, regardless of what occurs tomorrow. What you and Boomer have demonstrated to us alters everything we believe to be true about wildlife cognition, Emma replied quietly. And recollection, or Thomas nodded, looking beyond the tree line. It was never just regarding memory, he responded, that it was about comprehending and figuring out how to share this wilderness that values animal dignity and human safety. As darkness descended, they heard the first owls starting their nightly chorus. Would face its own difficulties tomorrow, including the board meeting, the threatened photographer protest, and the final judgment regarding Boomer's destiny. But, for the time being, Thomas in the gathering darkness.
Ready to demonstrate the remarkable possibilities that existed one final time.
In pre-dawn times, trust and understanding helped to bridge the gap between humans and the wild. The air was clear with excitement as Thomas walked by himself to the clearing after persuading Emma and Sarah to join him. They watched from a safe distance, yet they allowed him to make this final approach without being present. At times he realized their equipment needed the purest kind of confidence. The clouds were painted in exquisite pink and gold hues by Thomas when the eastern sky was just starting to lighten. Every step seemed heavy as he cautiously made his way through the morning mist, both bells now softly tinkling. This is our moment, after 40 years of remembrance, hope, and opportunity. He whispered all we've learned to the awakening forest, his companion. Everything we've demonstrated to them culminates in this. He arrived in the clearing's center as the first real rays as the daylight started to peek through the canopy. This location brought up a lot of training memories. Training aided in this fashion, sir. We got on board with practiced grace. As the daylight started to peek through the canopy, this location brought up a lot of training memories, sessions that have evolved into trust-building activities based on comprehension of a relationship that in some way defied both time and nature. Thomas brought up the "when bells rang out in unison, the sound spread throughout the valley." In the morning air, a melody that spoke of shared history was plain and sincere. He rang them in the traditional pattern, with 3 distinct notes and a pause, and unbroken links, then 2 more. It was the sound that served as their initial signal of safety and confidence. It once served as the habitat for a juvenile bear that was learning to cross 2 worlds in the forest. He heard Emma's voice in the distance, and it grew still as though holding its breath. Thomas maintained his attention despite the radio-reported movement on its monitors. He heard it on the clearing between the old trees where shadows were still clinging to the morning mist. Boomer had always announced his entrance through the thinning mist with the same puffing sound. Boomer's enormous form materialized, and he moved with purposeful grace, his fur touched by silver. Observing the early light, his intelligent eyes remained focused on Thomas. Clearly recognizable, rather than pausing at the customary distance, Boomer grinned at approaching each step carefully. He proceeded with his approach, measuring each step carefully. Thomas made a deliberate decision that mentioned the confidence he had gained over decades of respect, stayed motionless, his heart racing with a mix of wonder and comprehension when Boomer was only a few feet away when he made a slow yet remarkable move. With boundless tenderness, he dropped his enormous head until it touched Thomas's breast. It was a gesture of total confidence that goes beyond the distinctions between tame and wild. "Oh my God," he heard Emma whisper over the phone. "Human comprehension and animal instinct. Are you listening to the radio? This is extraordinary from every aspect." But Thomas hardly... When he heard her, he was taken back in time by 40 years, when he was first taught by a baby bear that species borders were more porous than anyone had thought. All of their mutual trust and understanding was supported by Boomer's head resting on his chest, protected in some way, and they stayed that way for 4 decades of separation. Man and bear were linked for a number of heartbeats by something that defied scientific justification. Thomas was able to detect Boomer's regular breathing. The creature in front of him had the ideal ratio of untameness to intelligence. This was no ordinary animal. It was far more than just memorizing tricks or reacting to training. Deep, mutual comprehension that had persisted over time and space. When Boomer eventually raised his head, his eyes intelligently met Thomas's, appeared to include both his untamed personality and their common past. The bear made a cautious step back while keeping their precise placement close enough to show their connection. Never forget what Thomas said to demonstrate his awareness of appropriate boundaries. Gently, his voice was full with emotion, and you understood not only the signs and patterns, but also the meaning behind them. That Boomer answered with the same quiet, puffing sound he has made for years. Utilized as a cub, and after a successful encounter, he proceeded cautiously and precisely through a few of roles that showed he fully remembered their safety procedures. Approaching the retreat while keeping the proper distances and approaches, the sun's stance and reaction brought that amazing connection to life. Risen, casting a golden glow across the area, perhaps blessing this next regular reunion moment. In the distance, Thomas could hear the ecstatic hum of the study team's radio conversation, which documented every aspect of this extraordinary exchange. But in this area between wilderness and realizing that time seemed to stop, the park meeting room was alive with a force that its walls had never seen before. The morning's video aired on the big screen, revealing the remarkable exchange between Boomer and Thomas from a variety of perspectives, including Morrison, who had been the most powerful anchor. As he observed the spectacle, the bear's supporter sat in startled silence. Over the course of my years working in wildlife management, Sarah Matthews started her voice with a note of wonder. I've never witnessed anything like this. The degree of confidence, the exact comprehension of limits, the unmistakable proof of cognitive processing and long-term memory. As Dr. Chen examined the video screen by frame, she was virtually giddy with anticipation. Throughout the interaction, the bear's body language demonstrated great control, movements, and a thorough comprehension of proximity protocols. This is not just recalled behavior, which is a clever and proactive interaction with established safety guidelines. Emma presented her scientific background to the board, considering what she said, what we saw this morning alters our understanding of the ERS indication. Memory and intelligence, but more significantly, it shows something important. Aspects of wildlife management that mutual respect and understanding can foster safer exchanges than ones based on fear and constraint. Thomas sat motionless. Boomer's head weighed 40 years on his chest as he processed the morning's stunning event. Memory and trust, a bond that went beyond the typical human-animal partnerships. But now came the vital responsibility of assisting others in comprehending the Morrison. Noted the importance of what they saw. The protest group of photographers is currently organizing their action. Even if his voice had lost its previous adamance, this revelation could further complicate matters. If we take advantage of this as an educational opportunity, more people will want to see this clever bear for themselves. At last, Thomas explained, that what Boomer has demonstrated to us is not only about memory or intelligence, but also about the potential for mutual understanding underpins coexistence, which we may utilize to instruct. Dr. Chen nodded when he spoke to individuals about appreciating wildlife on its own terms. Eagerly consider the ramifications of the research. We could create new guidelines for managing animals based on appreciating natural behaviors, instead of merely imposing limitations. This might completely change the way we manage interactions between people and wildlife in the park system that Sarah Matthews researched. The video once more, paying close notice to how Boomer kept precise distances even during the complication procedure. The bear exhibits greater boundary awareness than others during the closest encounters. This is so remarkable because he is deliberately choosing to follow these protocols, unlike the humans she watched. Emma concurred that this isn't about a circus act or a tame bear. Concerning a sentient wild animal's decision to interact with people in a controlled, secure manner, using the procedures Thomas founded 40 years ago, served as a platform for more than just training. Interspecies contact. The board members exchanged contemplative glances. The demonstration in the morning had changed the topic of discussion from risk management to one of extraordinary potential. Even Morrison appeared to be re-evaluating his stance. What if Dr. Chen recommended we created a unique study approach for this issue? Not only to examine Boomer's distinct behaviors, but also consider how we could benefit from his example. Find more effective methods for managing wildlife overall. Thomas felt hope rising in his chest. We could educational initiatives that instruct guests on actual wildlife behavior, not the sanitized version they receive in controlled settings, but the sophisticated exchanges that genuinely take place in nature. As Boomer's instance demonstrates, safety may be achieved more successfully with mutual respect and understanding than with the fences and limitations Sarah Matthews started erecting. Observes that we would have to create new protocols and, of course, reinforce the restricted zones, enhance educational outreach, perhaps even establish a specialized research team to record and examine these actions. And most all, Emma, furthermore, we defend Boomer's freedom while utilizing his example to instruct others on. He is demonstrating to us that there is a middle ground in appropriate wildlife contact between utterly uncontrolled and totally regulated, a place where comprehension establishes organic boundaries. As the meeting proceeded, with Thomas's ideas reflected about the exchange from that morning, how Boomer had come close to the ideal equilibrium between wild dignity and trust in his moves, the deep bond that had managed to endure 40 years apart. And it all suggested opportunities that went beyond practicalities. By the time the board decided on traditional wildlife management, the sun had already fallen, and Sarah Matthews stood to deliver the news, her expression displaying both professional contentment and their own amazement at how the park board's decision affected Yellowstone. Like Boomer would continue to study the ripples on a pristine mountain lake. But let his unique situation serve as the foundation for a fresh strategy to establish better control of the precious resources. As Thomas stood at his wildlife management and research desk, the early sun was casting golden hues across the mountains. Favorite spot to observe. While thinking back on the path that led them here, Emma stated that the additional monitoring stations are already being put up by the research team. Dr. Chen is accompanying him with her ubiquitous tablet, which she refers to as the Boomer protocol, a fresh approach to comprehending and recording intricate wildlife behaviors in their natural habitat. As the early sun caught the dew on the grass, Habitat Thomas grinned. His father, who always maintained that genuine conservation wasn't about regulating nature, but about comprehending it sufficiently to live with the new. The park would create a specialized study program centered on Boomer's situation as part of the holistic management plan, utilizing it to create more effective teaching strategies for human-wildlife interaction. Visitors would learn about the intricacy of animal intellect using systems that the significance of honoring natural limits, especially Boo, would continue to be able to live his life as a bridge between the wild and inhuman worlds. The photography team genuinely consented to assist Emma, according to looking over her mails, and after realizing the importance of our work here, they volunteered to properly record the project while according to study guidelines and at safe distances. In the distance, they could see what they are referring to as the wisdom of the wild. As he went about his morning routine, the Boomer's enormous body moved across the terrain with ease and respect. The limits they had set while preserving his fundamental wildness. He periodically took a moment to examine the novel study indicators, demonstrating the same astute curiosity that had characterized him as unique 40 years ago. Observe how he examines every new component. Thomas noted that he understands their purpose and is not merely accepting them. His decision to take part in this conversation between our worlds in the morning air is what makes him unique. Carried the sound of the bells, which are currently a part of the park's official research apparatus, where observation zones are marked, and enforce secure boundaries. Their ringing had come to represent the project and serve as a reminder that between species was feasible when it was founded on respect and comprehension. When Sarah Matthews arrived with the last set of documents, her expression was one of delight. Given the outcome, the new protocols are now formally in effect, and other parks and wildlife preserves are already requesting to investigate the strategy you've begun. Thomas Boomer initiated something important here, and Thomas corrected it gently 40 years later as he interpreted to us years ago that there was an alternative perspective on the interaction between people and wildlife. We simply needed to be prepared to comprehend. As if in reaction to his name, Boomer. Henson says, in reaction to his name, Boomer showed up at the edge of the clearing and he proceeded to one of the assigned observation locations with his signature grace. Keeping his stance flawlessly while observing their tiny gathering, the morning light captured his silver-touched fur. Emma's voice highlighted the characteristic scar that had initially prompted Thomas to return to Yellowstone. Every time he exhibits these behaviors, his flawless grasp of boundaries makes me feel soft with wonder. Thomas agreed. He's teaching us something new about what's possible with his willing participation in our research. Experiencing a deep sense of accomplishment, This was not merely a scientific discovery or a personal triumph. It was evidence of the potential for a more profound method of connecting with the natural world. That, beyond basic preservation to actual understanding, that boomers started to retreat into the jungle with each movement as the sun rose higher. The bells chimed, remaining precisely in line with their set procedures. The sound of their gentle morning breeze reverberates over the valley like a promise upheld over decades of time. "The ring of those bells will always be wonderful," Thomas remarked as he watched Boomer vanish into his untamed realm, not only for their symbolic meaning of our history, but also for their rhetoric. When Emma realized the deeper meaning of what they promised for our future, she grinned. "A future in which we learn to listen to the wilderness on its own," he said. "Terms precisely," Thomas responded, his heart brimming with appreciation for this remarkable work. Every rung of the bell in Second Chance serves as a reminder that some relationships are more enduring than time and distance, teaching us that learning to listen to the wild heart of the world, dear listeners, frequently leads to the greatest insight. I hope you have been moved by this remarkable story of Thomas and Boomer, and have been enlightened by the amazing opportunities that arise when we treat the natural world with reverence and learn about its history, reminding us that unexpected sources of wisdom might arise, and that some relationships can transcend space and time. If this trip through the heart of Yellowstone has touched you, we'd like to invite you to enjoy our group of wildlife lovers and storytellers by subscribing to our channel and subscribing to all of our videos and articles so that we can make more videos like this. Get more motivational tales that examine the deep relationships between. According to Thomas and Boomer, there is a similarity between humans and the natural environment, demonstrated to us that respect and understanding can create bridges across all barriers. We'd love to hear about your own encounters with the wisdom of the wild, so please leave your views in the comments section below. Keep in mind that each rung of the bell is an invitation to learn about something remarkable in the world. I hope you never stop listening to nature's peaceful wisdom till our next journey explains to those who are prepared to comprehend.